If we fast forward to now, well, if anything, what do you think needs to change with drug policy? Do you think it needs to be a more lenient approach, maybe leaning towards decriminalisation, or maybe are we not being harsh enough? Do you think there maybe needs to be stronger punishments?
Okay. I suppose my view would be one of decriminalisation. I'm not terribly interested in campaigning for things that are never going to happen. So you won't find me beating the drum for legalising heroin. Right. And actually, I think that legalising some drugs would probably cause much greater damage. Taking heroin as an example, if we legalised heroin, there is no government in the world that's going to legalise heroin without certain restrictions. You know, even if it was only that you could only get it when you were 18 or over, there would be restrictions to it, and there would probably be a cost. Now, what that means is that probably the black market in heroin would not go away. Mm-hmm. So you would have two markets operating in parallel. And interestingly, we actually know what that would look like because it's happened before. So in 1965, when the Brain Committee reported on heroin addiction in the UK, they recommended that doctors lose the right to prescribe for addiction, and that be vested in specialist drug addiction clinics. Mm-hmm. The government didn't act on that for 3 years. So, but doctors did, because most GPs didn't want heroin addicts on their caseload anyway. So as soon as the Brain Committee made that recommendation, the doctors took it as the opportunity to dispense with these clients, these patients that they didn't want. That meant there was a bunch of people who had been getting prescriptions from their GP for heroin who were now rattling around looking for something else and found it in Gerrard Street in London, where the Chinese community had for years been smoking Chinese number 3. And then two things happened. One was that a lot of people who had been using British pharmaceutical heroin found that they quite liked the zing of dirty street heroin. And the other was that if you were, like me, still getting a prescription, if you were one of the lucky ones, you could sell your British pharmaceutical heroin and buy a wheelbarrow full of street heroin. And what that meant was recruitment into heroin accelerated dramatically, because we would be selling British pharmaceutical heroin to people who wanted to use it at the weekend and try out and see what all the fuss was. So that recruitment accelerated, and consumption also accelerated. I went from 1 gram a day to 2 grams a day just because I could.
Yeah.
So that's not going to work, in my view. But we come to, there are things that we could do. Firstly, we ought to review the Misuse of Drugs Act. It's 1971 it went on the statute book. It's never been reviewed. I can't think of any single law in the UK that has been on the statute books for so long without a thorough review. In fact, it's just been added to. It still contains elements from... there are bits in the Misuse of Drugs Act about opium houses, because that was taken from the 1926 Dangerous Drugs Act. This is a nonsense. This needs to be reviewed. And, you know, the whole point of any law is to protect the rest of us and support those of us who are breaking that law. And you can't do that by just sticking something on the statute book and leaving it there. For my money, we should take away imprisonment for possession. We should have clearer guidelines on what possession means. At the moment, very few people go to prison in the UK for possession. Some do. It's a bit of a postcode lottery. If you're in a remote rural area, you're probably more likely to get a prison sentence for possession than you would if you were in an urban situation, for instance. It would be relatively easy to do. We would need clear guidance on what possession meant. At the moment, we have the Misuse of Drugs Act, which effectively and rather brutally splits people into suppliers or possessors. And there's no clear guidelines. And you can't be one, you have to be one or the other. In practice, that's a very, very blurred boundary. And some people will occasionally, you will get cooperative buying, where someone will go out and buy enough for him and 2 or 3 of his mates, and probably cover the cost of his own supply by bumping the price up slightly for his mates. Is that supplying? Probably not. It's a very, very blurred boundary. And it does mean that many people who I think probably are possessors go to prison as suppliers.